Here now, trial attorney and legal analyst Misty Marris, who's watching this trial as well. Misty, good morning to you. What has stood out to you in the prosecution's case so far? Some emotional testimony and some key evidence.
Yes, the prosecutor's case has been very, very emotional, to say the least, but let's focus in on the evidence that we've seen. A lot of this pulling together their story and their narrative that this was a crime of opportunity, that Jose Ibarra came across Lake and Riley while she was out running, putting together not just video footage, but also the data from her smartwatch, as well as DNA evidence. So really bringing all of that together. And this morning, what we saw unfold is that initial interaction with Jose Ibarra with law enforcement. And I thought there were some interesting pieces of evidence that came out in the body cam video that was shown that links back to the prosecution's narrative, specifically the hat that he was wearing, the scratches on his body that looked fresh. All of that feeding into the prosecutor's timeline, which is going to be critical for this case. And we know that that's something the defense is intending to attack. So a lot of what we've seen so far, really putting the pieces together for that judge who will ultimately make the determination.
So we know the defense will call Jose's two brothers, trying to cast doubt that they lived with him. They could be the killers, or at least he could not be. How do you expect them to respond to some of the evidence? Most specifically the DNA underneath her fingernails?
That's what we call battle of the experts, Marnie. That's actually going to be the part that's going to get really, really technical. So remember, this is a bench trial, and there's a bit of a different dynamic because it's a judge, not a jury. And one of the reasons I believe, based on everything we've learned about the case, is the defense made a whole slew of motions pre-trial to exclude that DNA evidence. They wanted to actually have some of the charges, specifically the peeping Tom charge, tried separately from these murder charges. So there was a whole host of evidence that they were trying to keep out of that courtroom. And ultimately, they decided to present this in front of a judge who's going to be a bit more of a tactician, as opposed to somebody or the jury who could be swayed by emotion. That being said, because this is largely a forensic evidence case, they're going to have experts try and undercut the prosecution's evidence. It's going to get highly technical, and it's going to be for that judge to decide. And that's another reason I think strategically they went before a judge instead of a jury.
Looking at the charges, he's got malice murder and felony murder charges against him. What's the difference?
So felony murder is a murder that's committed while a felony is being committed. So here there's underlying felonies. It's kidnapping and attempted rape, and then a murder occurs. Maybe the murder wasn't intended, but because of those underlying crimes, which are violent, and anybody would imagine that they could lead to someone's death, that is a felony murder. So murder in the commission of a felony. Malice murder is an intentional murder, meaning he meant to kill her. And remember, it doesn't have to be premeditated. There's a huge difference between premeditated and intentional. Premeditated, we think of it as planning and preparing, but an intentional murder, intent can be formulated in a second. So in the prosecution's narrative, when she fights back, he decides to kill her. That's the argument to formulate the intent. So two different theories of murder for the judge to choose from if he were to determine that Jose Ibarra is guilty.
You know, in a jury trial, the jury would be watching Jose Ibarra throughout the trial. His every move, his expressions, his emotions or emotionless actions as he sits in the courtroom. Is the judge doing that at all?
You know, the judge is still a human being, and I do think strategically from the defense perspective, part of going for a bench trial was to eliminate some of that emotional component, or as you say, Marnie, just those observations, especially with respect to the family or observing Jose Ibarra, who doesn't speak English. So his reactions may not be what a juror expects them to be, right? He's listening to everything through headphones. It's a bit different, but the judge is still a human. I'm sure he's observing, but there's a likelihood that it's going to be really focused and based on that evidence, that fulfillment of the burden beyond a reasonable doubt.
Life in prison is what he faces, not the death penalty, although Georgia has it. Why not in this case?
The death penalty requires what's called aggravating circumstances. And while this is absolutely, the allegations are heinous, and there's a factor that could be an aggravating factor that says a particularly heinous crime. When you usually see death penalty cases, you see them in multiple deaths. You see them minors or police officers. So there's a very specific statutory structure for what qualifies as a death penalty case. And it can actually make it a more difficult case for prosecutors. So when it's based on that particularly heinous category, you don't often see them being charged as death penalty cases. And that's likely why we see this case as the basically outside the death penalty, the most severe charges that could be imparted on a human being.
Misty, the next witness that will be taking the stand will be Jose Ibarra's roommate. What do you expect that questioning to look like for him? And then I guess when it comes down to it, his brothers as well. Is there the potential that they try to present an alibi for him?
Marnie, you read my mind. And while usually an alibi requires a prior filing to say that there may be an alibi witness, what I expect them to do, maybe they're not going to be an alibi for that specific time frame when Jose Ibarra is alleged to have killed Laken Riley, but they could poke significant holes in the timeline. When's the last time they saw him versus how long it takes to get to the campus? That's what I would expect the defense to do, to try and poke holes in the prosecutor's timeline of when this occurred and what happened. When did Jose Ibarra come back to the house? What did they observe? Did he look like he had just been in a struggle? Those are the types of questions I would expect to see. Because there was no pretrial filing identifying an alibi specifically, he's unlikely to say, well, I was with him at that time. But that doesn't mean it isn't going to be the same effect from the defense perspective, tearing apart the timeline for the prosecutors to the extent that that there's evidence to support that or to raise reasonable doubt.
All right. Well, we expect his roommate to take the stand here shortly. We're monitoring it closely. You can also watch it live streaming on NewsNationNow.com. Misty Marris, thank you as always.
Thanks, Marnie.